Well, the sulfur cap and trade in the United States was set up in the late 80s. It became effective in the early 1990s, and it continues today. And the reason that it came into being was we had a big problem in particularly the upper Midwest with sulfur emissions and acid rain. And so this was an experiment that was put into place by the federal government to try to use a market solution instead of the command and control that had been used in the past. Companies are granted permits, and then if they reduce their emissions, they can sell those permits to other companies that want to emit sulfur in this case. And if they decide to grow or for some reason have an increase in their emissions, then they can buy permits. Permits are not easy to account for. The problem is that the way that our system is set up, they're granted at zero cost. And if something costs zero in our traditional accounting systems, we don't put it on the books. On the other hand, it's clear that they're worth something because you can trade them if you don't use them. And so companies have these permits, but they aren't showing up on their financial statements. A bigger problem is if companies don't understand the value of the permits for their internal decision making. So if a manager is in a company where they're emitting carbon in the case of the European Union market for carbon trading, or in the United States for utilities with sulfur emissions, they need to be able to make the correct decision in terms of trading off using permits versus reducing pollution. And if they don't understand the value of those permits, then they aren't going to make the right decision. The permits that we looked at were permits that they're called banked. And these are permits that the company isn't using right away. So these can be used either as an investment, because they can sell them in the future, so it's almost like a marketable security or an asset that they buy. Another thing that they can do is they can use these banked permits to smooth the way that they reduce their pollution. Because if I have a bank of permits, I have the option to defer putting in pollution reduction control mechanisms such as scrubbers. So I can invest in permits. I can hope that the cost of the technology is going to go down in the future, or maybe that regulation is going to change. And the banks help me do that instead of having to install scrubbers right away. And so what we looked at in our paper was how the market values these bank permits. And what we found is that the market at least values them as an asset. So the fact that they show up as zero value on financial statements probably isn't the most effective means of disclosure to tell investors what the value of these permits are for the organization. Accounting is all about measurement, and we make decisions based upon what we measure. And if we don't have good measures for the value of these permits, the pricing of these permits, if that is ineffective, then it's going to make that market mechanism, which we're trying to use in contrast to something like command and control, it's going to make it less effective.